The first time Serafina Carter laid eyes on Elijah Hayes, she felt something she had never felt before, an inexplicable pull towards someone so far beneath her in status. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, no matter how much she tried. Elijah wasn't like the polished, arrogant billionaire heirs her father introduced her to at grand galas and elite gatherings. He was quiet, observant, and carried himself with a quiet strength. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, his deep voice sent an unexpected thrill down her spine. Serafina had grown up in luxury, the only daughter of Victor Carter, one of the most powerful oil moguls in the country. Raised in the heart of New York City, she had never known struggle, never had to fight for anything, except her own freedom. Her father had already mapped out her future. She was to marry one of the billionaire sons from his circle, solidifying their wealth and power even further, but Serafina had no interest in those men. Their arrogance suffocated her. Their wealth meant nothing to her. It was Elijah who had caught her attention. At first, she convinced herself it was just curiosity. He was different from the men in her world, tall, broad-shouldered, with rough hands that told stories of hard labor. He was always in his black security uniform, stationed at the front gates of their Upper East Side mansion, standing tall and alert. As if nothing in the world could shake him, she had watched him for months. Every morning, as she left the estate for her morning jog, she would slow down just a little as she passed the gates, stealing glances at him. He never seemed to notice, until one morning, their eyes met. That was the moment everything changed. Serafina started finding excuses to be near Elijah. She would deliberately walk through the gates instead of taking the private driveway, just so she could exchange a few words with him. "Morning, Elijah," she said one day, testing the waters. He looked surprised that she even knew his name. "Good morning, Miss Carter." His voice was deep, smooth, and respectful. "Serafina," she corrected, his brows furrowed slightly. "Your father wouldn't like that," she smirked. "My father doesn't control how I introduce myself." After that, their conversations grew longer. She learned that he had grown up in Brooklyn, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. He had been working security for a few years, trying to save up for something better. "What do you really want to do?" she asked him one evening as she lingered by the gates. He hesitated before answering. "I wanted to be an architect. But life doesn't always go the way you plan." Serafina felt a pang of sadness for him. He was smart, disciplined, and hardworking, so why was life so unfair to him, and why did she care so much? She knew she was falling for him, and it was dangerous. It happened one night after a grand charity gala at their mansion. Serafina had grown exhausted from faking smiles and pretending to be interested in the billionaire heirs her father pushed toward her. She stepped outside for fresh air and found Elijah standing at his usual post, his eyes scanning the area. "Rough night?" he asked. Noticing her frustration, she sighed. "You have no idea." For the first time, she saw a flicker of amusement in his dark eyes. "Try me." Maybe it was the moonlight. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, or maybe it was the months of built-up tension between them. But something in Serafina snapped that night. She stepped closer to him, feeling the warmth radiating from his body. "You ever think about breaking the rules?" she whispered. Elijah stiffened. "Serafina," she silenced him by pressing her lips against his. It was reckless. Forbidden. But neither of them could stop. That night, they crossed the line they could never uncross. Weeks passed, and Serafina knew something was wrong. The nausea, the fatigue, the missed period, it all pointed to one thing: she was pregnant. Panic set in. She couldn't hide this forever. And when her father found out, she had never feared her father before, but this would ruin everything he had planned for her. And Elijah, would he even want this? When Victor Carter found out, his rage was beyond anything Serafina had ever seen. A security guard. "You let a damn security guard touch you," he roared, his face red with fury. Serafina stood her ground. I love him, her father laughed cruelly. Love? You think this is love? That bastard saw an opportunity and took it. Do you know what this means for our family? For our reputation? Victor didn't stop at words. He made sure Elijah suffered. The next day, Elijah was arrested. The charges? Theft, fraud, assault. Crimes he never committed. Serafina rushed to the police station, only to find Elijah bruised and battered, handcuffed like a criminal. You did this, she screamed at her father. Victor didn't deny it. This is what happens when people forget their place. Serafina couldn't believe it. The man she loved, yes, loved, was being destroyed before her eyes, and a part of her hated him for it, because wasn't he supposed to fight for her? She had dreamed of this love, had longed for it. And now it was crumbling before her. Depression hit her hard. She locked herself in her room, refusing to see anyone. Food lost its taste. Sleep became her escape, and Elijah, he was suffering in ways she couldn't even imagine. But this wasn't the end. Victor Carter wasn't done with Elijah. He had more punishments lined up, ways to make sure he never even thought about his daughter again. And Serafina, she was about to make a choice that would change everything. Elijah had been beaten before. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood where survival meant knowing how to take a punch and when to walk away. But this was different. He sat in the cold, dimly lit cell of Rikers Island, his ribs aching from the brutal assault ordered by Victor Carter. The guards had whispered his name with contempt, as if he were the scum of the earth. The charges against him were fabricated, but in a city where money spoke louder than truth, it didn't matter. Meanwhile, Serafina was spiraling. She barely left her room, her once vibrant spirit crushed under the weight of her father's wrath and Elijah's betrayal, or at least, what she saw as betrayal. He hadn't fought for her. He hadn't even tried to reach out, but what she didn't know was that Elijah had been given a choice: leave Serafina forever, or face a punishment far worse than prison, and Victor Carter had made sure he understood the consequences. You think what I've done to you so far is bad? Victor had told Elijah, his voice dripping with venom. That's just the beginning. If you ever try to see my daughter again, I'll make sure you disappear. And trust me, no one will come looking for you. Elijah, bruised and broken, had only one choice. He signed a confession to crimes he never committed in exchange for a plea deal. 5 years in prison. No contact with Serafina. It was the only way to keep her safe. Weeks passed. Then a month. Then 2. Serafina waited for Elijah to fight for her. She waited for him to send a message, to prove that he hadn't just used her, and walked away. But nothing came. And then, the ultimate betrayal. At a lavish dinner party, Victor Carter stood before a crowd of elite businessmen and announced, "I'm pleased to share that my beloved daughter, Serafina, is engaged to William Lancaster III." The room erupted in applause. Serafina froze. William was a billionaire's son, arrogant, entitled, and exactly the kind of man her father wanted for her. She had rejected his advances for years, but now, without warning, she was being sold off like a business transaction. Her heart pounded. This was her father's final move, to erase Elijah from her life completely. She stood abruptly, knocking over her glass of wine. "I'm not marrying him." Victor's smile never faltered, but his voice was cold. "You will. And you will do it with a smile on your face." Serafina's hands trembled. "You can't force me." Victor leaned in, whispering just for her to hear. "I already did." And then, the final blow, Elijah took the deal. He's in prison. Serafina. He's gone. The words shattered her. He took the deal, so, that was it. He had given up on her. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. If Elijah wasn't going to fight, then she would. Serafina wasn't a fool. She knew her father would control every move she made, watch her every step. If she wanted the truth, she had to be smart, and that's when she made a bold decision. She would visit Elijah in prison, but not as herself, late one night, with the help of a trusted housemaid, she disguised herself, dark hoodie, minimal makeup, a fake ID. She knew her father would never let her step foot in Rikers Island, so she had to do this alone. She paid off a low-level prison guard, slipped through security, and made her way to the visitation room, and then she saw him. Elijah looked different. His once strong frame had lost weight, his face bruised, his knuckles scarred. But his eyes still held that fire. She sat down across from him, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you fight for me?" Elijah stared at her in shock. "Serafina? What the hell are you doing here? Answer me," she demanded, his hands curled into fists. "I did fight for you. You just don't know the war I had to fight." Serafina's heart pounded. "Tell me the truth." And so, Elijah told her everything, the threats, the beatings, the deal he was forced to take. He told her about the man her father really was. By the time he finished, Serafina was shaking with rage. Her father had lied to her. He had stolen Elijah's freedom, all to protect his own ego, and now, she was about to be married off like a pawn in his twisted game, but not anymore. Serafina had spent her entire life believing her father was a powerful but respectable businessman. But after seeing what he had done to Elijah, she knew there had to be more beneath the surface, secrets buried deep within his empire, and she was determined to find them. Locked in her room, she pored over company records, confidential emails, and bank transactions, using every resource at her disposal. She even reached out to an old college friend who worked in investigative journalism, someone who had always suspected that Victor Carter's fortune wasn't as clean as it appeared. What she uncovered made her stomach turn: bribery, fraud, illegal oil deals with corrupt politicians, environmental violations covered up with hush money. Victor Carter wasn't just ruthless, he was a criminal, and now, she had the proof, but she didn't want to expose him publicly. No, she wanted something more personal. She wanted Elijah back. The next morning, she walked straight into her father's study, where he sat sipping his coffee. Reading the business section of the newspaper, without hesitation, she threw a stack of documents onto his desk. He glanced at them and smirked. "What's this?" "More of your childish rebellion." Serafina folded her arms. "It's proof of every illegal deal you've made in the last 5 years. Offshore accounts, fake contracts, bribery, enough to have the government seize your assets and put you behind bars." Victor's smirk disappeared. He leaned back, staring at her with cold calculation. "You've been busy," he said slowly. She met his gaze without flinching. "Release Elijah. Drop the charges. Let him walk free," he chuckled, shaking his head. "And if I don't, I'll send this to the authorities. By the end of the day, the FBI will be raiding your office, and everything you've built will crumble." For the first time in her life, she saw something unfamiliar in her father's eyes. Fear. He wasn't afraid of losing money. He could make more. But power? Reputation? Control. That was what he truly valued. Victor exhaled sharply and looked at her with something close to admiration. "I underestimated you," he admitted. Serafina's voice was unwavering. "You did. Now make the call." With a heavy sigh, Victor picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer. "Drop the case against Elijah Hayes," he said, his tone clipped. Effective immediately, Serafina let out a shaky breath. She had won. Elijah was coming home. When Elijah was released from prison, Serafina was waiting for him outside the gates. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at her, as if he couldn't believe she was real. "You did this?" he asked, his voice raw. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I wasn't going to let him take you from me." Without another word, Elijah pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the only thing keeping him standing. But the battle wasn't over yet. Back at the Carter estate, Serafina's 2 older brothers, Nathan and Charles, had been watching everything unfold. Unlike their father, they didn't see her as a pawn in the family business. They saw their little sister fighting for her happiness. That evening, they approached Victor together. "Let her go," Nathan said. Victor glanced up from his drink, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me, you've controlled every part of her life," Charles added. "But this is her choice," Victor scoffed. "She's throwing her life away for a man who has nothing. A man who will drag her into poverty." "Maybe," Nathan said. "But it's her decision to make." For a long moment, Victor said nothing. Then, he stood, walked past his sons, and went straight to Serafina's room. She was packing. Suitcases lay open on the bed, filled with clothes, books, and small keepsakes. She was ready to leave. Victor watched her silently before speaking. "You really doing this?" She turned to face him, her expression firm. "Yes, you giving up everything, wealth, security, your future, for him?" Serafina nodded. "I'm choosing love over control." A long silence stretched between them. Then, Victor's face hardened. "Then don't come back," he said coldly. "From this moment forward, you are no longer my daughter. I will not care for you. I will not help you. You will mean nothing to me." Serafina's throat tightened, but she refused to cry. "I expected nothing less." Without another word, she picked up her bags and walked out. Her brothers stood at the door, watching the exchange with sorrow in their eyes. Nathan reached out and squeezed her hand. "You'll always have us," he whispered. Charles gave her a small smile. "And Mom," he added. "She'll always want to see you." Serafina smiled softly. "I'll visit when I can." And with that, she left the Carter estate for the last time. Serafina had never worked a day in her life, and now she was living in a small apartment in Brooklyn with Elijah. Learning how to cook, budget, and survive without luxury, but she was happy. Elijah found work in construction, determined to build a better future. Serafina got a job at a local bookstore, finding joy in simple things: morning coffee, handwritten letters, and walks in the park. They didn't have millions, but they had love. A year later, in a small, intimate ceremony, Serafina and Elijah got married. No extravagant ballrooms. No designer dresses. Just close friends, her brothers, and their mother, who cried tears of joy as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle. Victor Carter wasn't there, but for the first time in her life, Serafina didn't care. She had made her choice, and she had no regrets. Serafina built a life with Elijah, a real life, filled with love, struggle, and laughter. She visited her mother and siblings occasionally, but never returned to her father's world. She knew he still had his pride, his fortune, and his power, but she had something he would never have: freedom. And as she stood on the rooftop of their small Brooklyn apartment, watching the sunset with Elijah by her side, she smiled, because for the first time, she was truly at peace.
Please subscribe, like, comment and share this video. It means a lot to us. Thank you.